Have you ever wondered if a certain tool could be holding you back from creating the art you want, or whether trying something new could accelerate your progress? Well, I did. I've been trying to improve my watercolor and mixed media skills intensively for the past year and a half, and one of the ways I've been doing that is through a dedicated sketchbook practice. But there are so many options out there: hot press, cold press, cotton, cellulose. How do you know what's going to work best for what you want to accomplish? In this video, I'm going to give you a tour through 4 sketchbooks I've completed over the past 10 months. We're going to look at the paper, how it responds to different media, and answer the age-old question: can a single sketchbook actually help you improve? After 10 months, I believe I've found the answer, and the results might surprise you. So stay tuned, because this is going to be an incredible journey. If you're new here, welcome to my channel, Voluptas Ocularum. It means pleasure of the eye. My name is Stephanie, and I'm a watercolor and mixed media artist living in the UK, where I draw inspiration from the beautiful landscapes all around me. Over the past year and a half, I have amassed a lovely collection of watercolors, but last year I wondered how my work might grow through using a sketchbook. So I've decided to try a whole range of options, and I'm going to take you through them one by one and tell you which one actually changed my art practice for the better. Starting from left to right, we have the PITH Lumia. Next up, the Koval Wild handmade sketchbook with Fabriano paper. Then the Stillman Birn Beta Series, and finally the Etcher Everyday sketchbook. Each of these sketchbooks has pros and cons, but until I actually used them to create art, or try to create art, I couldn't really tell which option was going to be the best for me. So this video reflects 10 months of hard work and all of my art progress over that time. Let's get started. First up, we have the PITH Lumia, a popular sketchbook for urban sketching and made here in the UK. This sketchbook has 200 GSM acid-free cellulose paper that is ivory colored and very lightly textured. It has a lay flat binding that makes it easy to create spreads across the pages, and there are 76 pages to work on. The cost right now is £19 or 25 pence per page. If you work with wet media like I do, you will notice that these pages buckle, but it's still surprisingly strong for the weight of the paper, and this never interfered with my work and generally flattened out once I closed up the sketchbook. The paper has a very light texture. It almost appears smooth compared to watercolor paper, but overall, it's a really nice paper to work on. So let's flip through page by page so you can see everything that I did in this sketchbook. I generally start from the back and work my way forward to help eliminate the fear of the first page. I also tend to swatch materials just to see how they look on the paper and how the paper reacts. So I actually started this in late September, but I would say the first real test of the sketchbook was in October when I followed the 2024 Inktober challenge. I didn't do this in a typical way. I just painted with fountain pen inks as a background, and then I sometimes drew over top with a dip pen. It was early on that I realized this paper will scrub away if you get it too wet, and we'll look at this in a little bit more detail later on. I got to about day 21 before I abandoned the challenge because I was traveling and visiting family and things were just really hectic. But I picked the sketchbook up again in December as the holidays approached and had a little bit more time. So I was experimenting with my gelatos and with paint sticks, and then I started developing a winter watercolor palette, which I have another video on if you're interested in seeing that. It was during December and January that I got really committed to this sketchbook, and I attribute that to both getting to know the paper more and also just having a little bit more time on my hands during the holidays. So I was able to test out other materials like Unison soft pastels, Neocolor 2s, and a variety of colored pencils, which are pretty typical for me to use over top of my watercolor bases. I also used gouache from time to time with tempera paint sticks over top. And at this point I was feeling pretty comfortable in the sketchbook, so I decided to do another challenge, and this was a Draw Everyday challenge called The Daily Art Flow by another artist named Lena Motes. I support her on Patreon, and during the month of January she would provide a photo reference every day to work from. So mostly I enjoyed doing this challenge. I found the references a tiny bit dreary, just because I'm not sure if you're aware, but the UK is a pretty dark, depressing place in the winter, and I was craving some sun and vibrancy, and just some of the reference photos were just a little too dull for me. But luckily, my husband and I were just about to spend 5 weeks in Spain, so I was able to take this sketchbook along with me to work on completing the challenge while I was away, as well as get some much needed vitamin D. I tried to use a variety of media during this challenge, including Neocolor 2s, paint sticks, soft pastels, and both watercolor and gouache. But definitely my favorite approach was watercolor with some colored pencils over top. I found that I was able to get a pretty good amount of fine detail on this paper while also being able to use a few layers of watercolor as long as I didn't push it too wet. And I didn't have any issues using several layers. As the challenge approached the end, I had a little bit less time to work, so some of the drawings were rushed while I was both working full-time and trying to sightsee. But while I was in Spain, I picked up a little art graph from a local store and decided to use it for the final drawings, just to see if I could reduce colors to values. Art graph, if you're not familiar, is a pretty fun material. It's a water-soluble graphite puck that I used a water brush with, and that basically took me to the end of January. In February, I did a small amount of watercolor landscape sketching, but this month was really busy as I was both recovering from a surgery and working full-time, so I didn't get a chance to finish this off until later in March when I finally did this page with a beautiful National Trust garden in Dorset that we had visited the year before. So that takes care of the flip through, and now let's move on to looking at a few pros and cons that I ran into. First, the cons. The obvious one is that on a paper this weight, heavy moisture will cause the paper to break down. But frankly, the rest of my experience was all positive. I found that colors showed up really beautifully on this paper, even though it is slightly off-white. And it was great for pen and ink, with fine lines showing up wonderfully well over top of the fountain ink backgrounds that I had painted. Surprisingly, granulating paints still showed up on this smoother surface, and I could achieve a lot of texture with media like gelatos and paint sticks. I found that fine details were pretty easy to achieve with either brush strokes or using colored pencils, which layered really nicely over this paper. And when I used thicker mixed media like gouache and tempera paint sticks, there were no issues at all with maintaining distinct colorful layers. And in fact, the more dryish layers that I used, the more interesting the textures. I should mention that I never really had the opportunity to test this as a plein air sketchbook because it was always during the cold, rainy autumn and winter months. But with a relatively fast drying surface, I think that this would work well for outdoor sessions as well as studio sketchbook work. So all in all, I really enjoyed experimenting with this sketchbook, and I do have a few more like it in my stash that I'll likely return to over again. Let's turn our attention to the next sketchbook in the series, the Koval Wild. This is 300 GSM, 100% cotton, cold press, Fabriano Artistico paper in traditional white, which is an off-white sort of ivory color. And this is supposedly lay flat binding, but because of the thickness of the paper, I found that it didn't really lay flat. There are 36 pages in this sketchbook, and at the time I purchased it, this sketchbook was 36 pounds, which brings it to a whopping 1 pound per page. You'll see that this paper actually buckled quite a bit, which is a little surprising given the weight of the paper. And the paper itself is very strongly textured. So you can see that the paper carries a lot of texture in it. And to be honest with you, I struggled using this paper and I was kind of glad when the sketchbook was over. I started out with some plein air studies. So in early October, I brought the sketchbook out with me on a few outings, and I initially thought that I really enjoyed the paper, but after that, I was using my Lumia sketchbook, and then when I came back to this in March, I started trying to do some landscape studies similar to what I had been doing in the Lumia sketchbook, and I was finding it really difficult to adjust to this paper. So what you'll see is that wet on wet techniques work really, really well, but trying to do delicate background layers with some mixed media over top, that just didn't go as planned. I think my favorite pages were when I was working quickly and I I didn't use too many layers and used kind of a dry brush technique. But for the majority of the time that I used the sketchbook, especially using it plein air, I was just really frustrated. The paper took an incredibly long time to dry, so I just felt like I was sitting around waiting and waiting and waiting, and then I would get impatient and add things over top while the paper was still wet, and it just ended up becoming a really muddy mess in some cases. I also found it really difficult to get fine detail on this paper. I had a few successes with different types of materials I was using. I did some gouache studies of this flower, but then anytime I tried to return to my typical method of watercolor background with some mixed media over top, I felt like it was coming out sort of cartoony and illustration-like instead of realistic, and there weren't those beautiful, visible, translucent layers that I had been getting on the Lumia sketchbook. So by the time I reached the end of the sketchbook, I was glad to see the back of it. So let's go through some of the pros and cons, and unfortunately there are quite a few cons. The paper is ultra textured, and I found that very difficult to work with, primarily because it was really difficult for me to get fine details, and after using the really smooth Lumia paper, this was a really hard adjustment for me to make. I also found that the colors appeared kind of dull on this paper, and I can't say it's because it's an ivory color, because the Lumia paper was also ivory and the color showed up fine there. Mixed media didn't layer well, or maybe I just didn't know how to layer it well on this paper, but basically things just ended up looking really muddy. The paper itself does not lie flat because it's so thick. You can see this compared to the Lumia sketchbook. It just kind of wants to be open, and I found that paint traveled in between the pages in the creases. The pages also buckled quite a lot, which I was kind of surprised by. That leads me to the pros, which is that wet on wet actually worked really beautifully. So if you have patience and a lot of time in a hairdryer, that might be a good way to use this sketchbook. For some reason, gouache worked well. I'm not sure why, or if I was just having a really good day, but these flowers turned out pretty nicely. Granulation and texture showed up amazingly well on this paper. That's to be expected with all of that tooth and texture in the paper. And I think it was really good for dry brushing. So on days when I didn't overthink it and I was able to use a dry brush technique, that actually showed up really beautifully. All in all, I think you can get good impact from this paper, but for me, this was not the right sketchbook for what I wanted it for, and I was happy to move on to the next one. Now, the next sketchbook is one that a lot of people are familiar with, and that is the Stillman Birn Beta Series. I got mine in a square format. This is cold press 270 GSM cellulose paper. It is bright white, so the complete opposite of the paper I had been using before, and it does have lay flat binding as well, which actually worked this time, which is amazing. It also has 50 pages, which is a decent amount for a small square sketchbook. This is 7 by 7 inches, and the cost was £18.90, so about 38 pence per page. Pretty good value. Now, despite this not being 100% cotton paper, it did not buckle all that much. It was actually really sturdy and strong. The page texture is very light, even though it says it's a cold press, so I would say this is a little bit more than the Lumia, but definitely less than the Fabriano paper. So let's do a flip through, and as usual, I started by swatching a lot of materials, and actually in this sketchbook, I swatched for quite a few pages because I had been receiving some new materials that I was wanting to test out. I took the opportunity to use this paper for them. I think I was just really enjoying the paper, so I did a lot of swatching. And then I thought, hey, why am I using this paper for swatching when I should be drawing on it? So around the middle of April, I took it on as a landscape sketchbook. And I was actually really inspired by what I was able to create within this sketchbook. So from the first painting that I did, I started seeing some of the familiar luminous layers that I had become familiar with from the Lumia sketchbook, but I actually found this paper both very absorbent and also incredibly strong. So it was able to take really good layers, and the colors were showing up very luminous on this paper. So I just found myself really enjoying painting on it, and that actually inspired me to do not one, not two, and not three, but actually 4 paintings a day sometimes, because I was enjoying it so much. As the weather got increasingly nicer during the spring, I used this as a plein air sketchbook, taking it out on a few different outings to the beach and to the forest. And then at the very end of May, I brought it along with me to a watercolor workshop that I attended at the Flatford Mill National Trust in Suffolk, and that was called Freshen Up Your Watercolors, where the instructor had us focus on painting plein air, mostly sort of rural scenes, but oftentimes with buildings in them. And I did learn quite a bit from this workshop, which I really enjoyed. So I used this as a little bit of a guide while I was learning from that workshop, but then I also took those lessons away. And as I continued to work in the sketchbook, I got increasingly confident in my ability to meaningfully reproduce scenes from both references as well as in person. So I started using brighter colors, I started mixing colors more, and I started taking on subjects that previously would have felt too complicated for me, like streetscape scenes or this scene of Florence from across the River Arno. And overall, I really, really enjoyed using this sketchbook, and I was really sad when it ended. I wished that there was more. All right, let's go through some of the pros and cons. And the only con I could really think of is that I wished there were even more pages because I enjoyed this sketchbook so much. On the pro side, look at these beautiful, luminous, bright colors that shine through on this bright white paper. I just loved using brighter colors than normal on this paper, and it really inspired me to try mixing. I also found that both detail and texture stood out really well on this paper, so I could get texture where I wanted it, but I also got a lot of great detail whenever I needed to. With glazing, I was able to see the layers behind each glaze really beautifully. They all stood out individually, and I loved that about this paper. Wet on wet techniques actually worked really well, which is surprising considering this isn't 100% cotton, but anytime I used wet on wet, I was surprised at how lovely it turned out. And mixed media layers were really nice on this paper. I was able to use quite a few different mixed media techniques, and they all kind of showed through in their own individual layers. Using this sketchbook really inspired me, and it gave me a lot of confidence in my work. I felt like the previous sketchbook had traumatized me, but in this one, I felt myself grow by leaps and bounds just because the paper was so much better suited to what I wanted to accomplish. So I cannot recommend this sketchbook highly enough. We've gotten to the last sketchbook in this tour, which is the Etcher Everyday sketchbook. This had cold press, 230 GSM, 100% cotton paper in a traditional white. So this was very similar to the ivory color of the Lumia sketchbook. And this did have lay flat binding as well, which I found really helpful, and it did work fairly well. There are 52 pages in this sketchbook, and currently this sketchbook costs £27, which equates to 52 pence per page. Now this paper, despite it being slightly thinner than the previous sketchbook, actually held up really well in terms of buckling. And I'm not sure if that has to do with the cotton content, but yeah, it did really well. And this is the light texture of the pages, so I would say this is a lot less than the Fabriano, but more than the other two sketchbooks. Let's start our flip through. So I just did one page of swatching, and this was just my winter watercolor palette that I swatched out. And then I did a test piece on this paper in April, but I really didn't start using the sketchbook until June after I finished the Stillman Birn sketchbook. So I started out with some landscape studies, and I immediately took it on some plein air adventures because we were having amazingly beautiful weather in June, and I was inspired to go out and take this sketchbook with me everywhere I went. So I had some successes and some failures in this sketchbook, but overall I would say this was a really great sketchbook to bring outside. The only downside to it was that it was a little large for the bag that I normally carry at 8 inches square. It was just a little bit bigger than the Stillman Birn, so I had to bring a bigger bag, but that's okay. When I was working on this paper in the studio, doing studies from reference photos that I had taken, I found it really great for what I wanted to accomplish. So I was able to carry forward all of the lessons I had learned in the previous 3 sketchbooks and do some studies that used more vibrant colors, that used layers in a nice way, that took all of my favorite materials and used them kind of intelligently over top of each painting. And although this paper was in general very nice, sometimes I ran into some issues. I wasn't really able to communicate some of the reference photos that I was using properly. Some of them I was able to do really well, but others I felt, I don't know, something just lacked in them. And I don't know if that was down to me just feeling maybe time constrained while I was working on them, but I did actually try a few new techniques in this sketchbook, like these flowers, which I didn't do in any of the previous sketchbooks. And I have always enjoyed flowers, but I've always felt not so confident in actually drawing them. But this sketchbook made me want to try it because the vibrancy of the colors was showing up beautifully. I did some more plein air sketching, and I also did some chalk pastel work, like you can see here. I'm reaching the end of the sketchbook, and I realized it was less than a month that I was able to finish this sketchbook in, which is absolutely insane. I did draw almost twice a day in the sketchbook because I loved using it so much. And at the end, if I look at my work at the end compared to where I was at the very, very, very beginning of this art journey that I've been on, I'm actually astounded at how much I have improved. And I can attribute that to my sketchbook practice. So here we've gotten to the final page, and now let's take a look at some pros and cons. So my only tiny little gripe with this paper is that I felt like it could be slightly thicker. Not by much, just maybe another 20 GSM, and that would have made it absolutely perfect for me. I did feel like the colors were super vibrant and beautiful. They just shined through on this paper, and colors blended really easily and beautifully. I felt like things really stood out in a way they didn't on some of the other papers I used. You could also really clearly see the granulation and texture on the pages, which I thought lended a really beautiful atmosphere and quality to some of the images I did. I felt that the layers I used with both wet and dry media were really luminous. Like I felt like the colors really shined through even though I was layering quite a bit. Fine detail was pretty easy to achieve. You can see here the pen details over top of this architecture. And when I was doing mixed media layering, for example, with some gouache paints on this one, I felt like it handled really well. I also used some Unison soft pastels here, and those went on no problem. I really enjoyed this sketchbook. I felt like it allowed me to do everything that I wanted to do and also helped me expand my drawing and painting practice into new techniques and new subjects, which I really appreciated. So now that we've had a chance to take a look inside each of these sketchbooks, I want to kind of systematically go through and rank them based on which one actually made me progress as an artist the most. The first thing to say is that every sketchbook had some wins, and painting and drawing is a little bit subjective. Some days you have it and some days you don't, and it doesn't matter how often you practice. Sometimes you're just going to have an off day and things just aren't going to go to plan. But in these sketchbooks, every single one of them had some qualities where I was able to do art that I really enjoyed and that I felt helped me grow as an artist. But definitely some of the sketchbooks were more than others. And alongside that, every sketchbook had some fails. So even no matter how good the sketchbook was, sometimes I just wasn't in the mood to create, or I picked a bad reference, or I used the wrong technique, or I went a little crazy with layers. And that happens all the time. That's not just the sketchbook. Sometimes that's just you. So I would say there are some sketchbooks where this happened more often than others. So I was trying to figure out a way I was going to rank these sketchbooks, and what I came up with was how many pages did I do where I felt a sense of artistic flow, because the flow state is what we're all aiming for in our practice, and that's the state where you feel like your skills meet the materials in a way that allows you to do what you want to do and express what you want to express without any hesitation. So I went through every single page of these sketchbooks and I thought about, when I was creating this page, what did I feel? And that is how I have ranked these sketchbooks. So in the PITH Lumia sketchbook, I determined that I felt flow on 40 out of 60 pages. Now here I have an asterisk, and that is because I have not counted the pages that I was only doing swatching on. Swatching is important, but I don't think it really contributes to the type of art that I was aiming to create, so I've just removed it. In the Koval Wild sketchbook, I determined I felt a sense of flow 9 out of 36 pages. That's a rate of about 25%, and that was not super amazing. So it's no surprise that I was ready to move on from this sketchbook as soon as it was over. In the Stillman Birn Beta Series, I determined that I felt flow a whopping 38 out of 41 pages that I worked on, and that is a rate of 93%. That is incredible, and I'm going to talk about why this matters a little bit later. Finally, in the Etcher Everyday sketchbook, I felt a sense of flow 37 out of 52 pages. That's a rate of 71%. So my final ranking is that the Stillman Birn series Beta sketchbook is the one that really helped me progress my art the most and changed everything. So I feel like we finally have an answer to the question, can a single sketchbook change or improve your art practice so dramatically? And my answer is yes. And the reason for that is not necessarily because of the individual qualities of each page of this sketchbook. It is more that this sketchbook really allowed me to feel confident in the work that I was creating to the point that it inspired me to create every day and sometimes multiple times a day. And any sketchbook that inspires you to create that often is automatically going to help you improve because you're going to be drawing and painting with your materials much more frequently. We all know that the key to progressing is practice. And so a sketchbook that inspires you to practice is going to have a huge impact on the art that you're able to create. But just because I found a sketchbook that I love doesn't mean I'm done exploring sketchbooks. I have 4 new ones that I'm considering: the Pink Peg 270 GSM spiral bound sketchbook, a Cotty fat book with 100 GSM paper and 100% cotton rag, a Canson art book with Saunders Waterford 300 GSM 100% cotton paper, and a Stillman Birn Beta Series, which is 270 GSM but smooth instead of cold press. Which one do you think that I should try next? Let me know in the comments if you've tried any of those sketchbooks and have suggestions for me. Thank you so much for joining me on this amazing journey. I really hope you enjoyed this video, and I can't wait to see you in the next one.